The young woman was found in her own home, and the investigation into this case dragged on for several decades. Even though the police had a DNA sample of the culprit, they had to wait as long as 40 years before technology allowed them to find a culprit. The truth came out only in 2021, and the Coca-Cola can help the police in this. Sylvia Mae Quayle was born on September 23, 1946 in Denver, Colorado. Soon she had a younger sister named Jo. The family lived in a quiet suburban area of Cherry Hills. Sylvia was ambitious, funny, and friendly. She had many friends, and they all called her the life of the party. From an early age, the girl became interested in architecture, inspired by the works of her uncle, who worked in this direction. In addition, she was a very creative person. She enjoyed sculpting with clay and cooking. After graduating from school and university, Sylvia got a job as a secretary at a local architectural firm. Thanks to her culinary skills, she also opened a small business baking custom wedding cakes. Sylvia continued to maintain a very close and trusting relationship with her family. She rented a place just 45 meters from her parents and tried to see them every day. Very often she came to them to have breakfast before leaving for work. On the evening of August 3, 1981, Sylvia, who was 35 at the time, spoke to her younger sister on the phone. She agreed to meet the next morning, and at about 11 o'clock Sylvia went to bed. The next day, at about 8 a.m., her father picked her up to go out for coffee together. However, no one responded to the knock on the door, so the man thought that his daughter was still sleeping. Then he went into the house, where a heartbreaking sight awaited him. Sylvia was lying on the floor in the living room. She was wearing absolutely no clothes, and her hands were folded above her head. There was a lot of blood all over the room, and the body itself was disfigured. The man barely pulled himself together and called the police. Before their arrival, he covered Sylvia with a towel. When police arrived at the crime scene, they examined the house and made several important discoveries. First, the telephone cable in the living room was cut. The outside wire was also damaged. The criminal threw a garden hose over it and cut it off with a sharp jerk downwards. All this indicated that the unknown killer had made sure in advance that the victim would not be able to call the police. Secondly, the killer tried to enter Sylvia's house through several windows. Detectives found a small hole in the mesh on the window in the girl's bedroom. This indicated that the criminal initially tried to get into the house from there, but for some reason was unable to do so. Then he turned his attention to the window in the bathroom. The net on it was removed and thrown into the bushes, more than 15 meters from the house. Signs of forced entry were found on the wooden window frame. Detectives also determined that the window itself was not initially locked. This was easily explained by weather conditions. During the day, unbearable heat reigned, and people had to leave their windows open in order to somehow escape from it. In total, about 140 different pieces of evidence were found at the crime scene, but in those years, forensic science did not yet have the necessary tools to study them in detail. After talking with Sylvia's relatives, the police established an approximate time frame for the murder. This happened between the conversation with my sister at 11 p.m. and the moment when my father stopped by at 8 a.m. After studying Sylvia's body, medical experts made a number of important discoveries. The woman received several bullets from a .22 caliber weapon, as well as several blows with a sharp object. Forensic scientists established that the perpetrator used a knife from Sylvia's kitchen, and in addition, he was highly likely to have subjected her to violence. Experts also concluded that before her death, the woman tried to fight back the criminal. This was evidenced by several broken nails. Unfortunately, all these clues did not bring the police any closer to catching the criminal. In those years, experts simply did not have the necessary tools to get at least some leads on the available evidence. The police were also unable to find any witnesses who might have spotted the killer that night. Because of this, there was absolutely no progress in the case for 2 years. In 1983, forensic experts decided to re-examine crime scene evidence using new laser technology developed by Canadian scientists. It also existed at the time of Sylvia's murder, but at that time the necessary equipment was only available in a Canadian laboratory, and its use cost a lot of money. But in 1983, portable and cheaper lasers began to appear, allowing experts to take a second look at the evidence, and it bore fruit. On the carpet that lay in Sylvia's living room, foreign traces of biological material were found, which most likely belonged to the criminal. However, science was still far from knowing the identity of the killer from this dater. That same year, notorious serial killer and robber Otis Alvid Toole confessed that he killed Sylvia. The police and the girl's relatives hoped that this case would finally be solved, but his statement was quickly called into question. He was confused in his testimony and could not give any significant details about this crime. In addition, in total, Toole confessed to 125 murders, of which only 6 were ultimately proven. Therefore, his words were not given much significance. Since then, the case has been frozen for 19 years, until they decided to reconsider it in 1995. At that time, criminology had made great strides forward, and investigators were hoping to get more information about that sample of biological material from the carpet. He was sent to the FBI laboratory, but they were unable to extract a DNA profile in a short time. It took 5 long years until the long-awaited breakthrough finally happened. In 2000, the police had a DNA sample of the killer in their hands. He was entered into the FBI database, but there were no matches. This meant that the offender had not previously been prosecuted for serious crimes, or this happened before the mandatory collection of DNA from the defendants. At this point, the matter again reached a dead end. The police could only hope that Sylvia's killer would be caught committing some other crime, and his DNA would be added to the database. There were no other ways to establish his identity in those years. But progress did not stand still. In 2019, nearly 20 years after the DNA sample was recovered, a non-profit called Denver Crime Stoppers merged with a genealogy company led by a former district attorney. Together they worked on unsolved cases in which the police had a DNA sample of the killers, but could not establish their identity. The organization searched for matches in genetic databases, looking for relatives of DNA owners. The company's research has helped solve many cases that were considered hopeless for decades. In January 2020, detectives from the Cherry Hills Cold Case Unit contacted the organization for help, providing them with a DNA sample from Sylvia's killer. They began their search using 2 public DNA databases. They were mainly used to find relatives and reconstruct family trees. People around the world could upload their DNA samples to find lost or even unknown family members. In the case of Sylvia's killer, specialists had to do the same. And here one problem awaited them. There were more than 3,000 relatives of this person in the databases. The experts had to do a tremendous amount of work to get to the right name. They began to look for any information on these people, gradually weeding out the most distant relatives, and those who at that time could not commit Sylvia's murder due to age. Only after 4 months of work, they finally had only one name left: David Dwayne Anderson. Investigators found that he was 22 years old at the time of Sylvia's murder. He lived near her home in Englewood. Detectives determined that he had moved to a small town called Azote, Nebraska, but at that time he could not be arrested on murder charges. For this, more significant evidence was needed, such as a direct match of his DNA with the sample found at the scene of Sylvia's murder. On January 18, 2021, detectives went to his home and began surveillance of him. After waiting for David to go outside to throw out the garbage, one of the police officers removed the 2 garbage bags from the container and transferred their contents to the laboratory. The bags contained 15 items that could help detectives obtain a sample of David's DNA. Among them was a can of Coca-Cola, as well as a bottle of drinking water, spiced rum, and beer. After almost 2 weeks, experts were finally able to extract a DNA sample from a Coca-Cola can. It was immediately compared with the sample found at the scene of Sylvia's murder, and a complete match was obtained. 40 years later, police finally have the name of the culprit. He was arrested on February 10 and charged with murder. But at that moment, the man was already 62 years old. This was announced at a major press conference, during which the researchers expressed their condolences to Sylvia's relatives. The head of the Cherry Hills Police Department, Michelle Tavraya, also spoke there. She told those present what kind of person Sylvia was and prepared a slide with photographs of her to accompany the story. Unfortunately, Sylvia's parents did not live to see the name of the killer finally become known. Her father died in 1999, and her mother 10 years later. However, investigators notified her younger sister, and she took part in the trial against David. After studying his biography, detectives found that Anderson participated in at least 8 robberies from 1981 to 1986. He fell into the hands of the police, but did not receive any serious punishment. Based on this investigation, I put forward 2 versions of what happened. Either Sylvia's murder was premeditated and pre-planned, or David wanted to rob her house, but ran into a woman, and a struggle ensued between them. He himself refused to admit his guilt, so the case was brought to court. If Anderson is convicted of murder, he faces life in prison with the possibility of parole only after 20 years. That was the state law in 1981 at the time of Sylvia's murder. Currently, criminals in prison for murder are not eligible for parole. Anderson was scheduled to be jailed in Dawson County, Nebraska, but he waived extradition and was jailed in Colorado. It was originally planned that the trial would end on March 8, 2022. However, as often happens, the process was delayed. At the next hearing, he was found guilty of brutal first-degree murder and sentenced to life, with the right to appeal after 20 years. Sylvia's sister was unable to come to court, but wrote a letter, which was read by lawyers. In the letter, she talked about how many times she imagined how the life of her only beloved sister would turn out. How much he misses her. She wrote that Dad was never able to come to terms with the loss, and changed a lot after he discovered his daughter murdered.